I will quickly introduce them. The concept of this panel is that we wanted to engage with practitioners and creators of children's literature and how they engage with concepts of criminality and punishment and social justice in their work, which are in themselves very mutable and malleable abstractions defined by the people who are in power. So I'm quickly going to introduce them, and then they will each take up about 10 to 12 minutes of the panel to speak about their work, and then we will move on to the Q&A. So first up, we have Samina Mishra, who I'm sure many of you know is the author of Jamlo Walks, which was discussed yesterday in a beautiful presentation, and Ida Finds a Way, published by Duckbill. Samina also runs the Magic Key Center for Arts, Happiness Class, and she's a documentary filmmaker working on childhood and citizenship. We are looking so forward to the perspectives that you're going to bring in on this. Tanu Singh is a psychologist and an author whose book Darklist has been published by Pickle Your Books. If you are interested in picture books, I think Pickle Your Books should be right somewhere at the top of your list for picture books because they bring out the best of picture books. Payal Dhar is, of course, an author who came up yesterday also in the keynote conversation because her book, Slightly Burnt, was one of the first YA queer novels published in India. Her more recent book is It Has No Name. And I happen to have one of the very last copies of Slightly Burnt in circulation, so I'm very happy about that. Bijal Vachharajani is the award-winning author of A Cloud Called Dhura and Savi and the Memory Keeper, both of which are fairly recent. She is also the recipient of this year's, let me confirm the name so I do not get it wrong, of this year's British Council International Publication Fellowship 2022 and the commissioning editor at Pratnam Books. We are so excited. And finally, welcome to India, Leah, virtually. I hope I can welcome you to India in person one day, but Leah is here. She is the founder president of the YA Studies Association. So I think for aspiring academics in children's and YA literature, she's already changing the world for us. Thank you. And she is an assistant professor at Plymouth Margin University in the UK. I am not going to talk anymore. I am straight going to hand over to Payal because she has a very interesting anecdote of Slightly Burnt that I think we could really start the conversation with and how that plays into the issues of criminalization of certain bodies.
Yeah, thanks so much. And also for asking me to be part of this panel. And since you talk about how terrified you are, you have no idea how terrified I am because I was quite happy in my shallow little world writing my books until you academics turned up and started asking tough questions that got us to examine our own work in ways that we had never thought about. So yeah, is it okay if I share my presentation?
Yes, ma'am, it's absolutely okay.
Okay, right. Okay, so yeah, so I was quite stumped actually when I was asked to be part of this panel because I thought, what do I know about this whole crime, punishment, justice cycle, and it kind of started me down this rabbit hole from which I haven't yet emerged because I mean, the more I think about it, the more fascinating it gets to me because I kind of, I have kind of come to realize that it's actually a staple of children and YA literature, and we can sort of see almost every children's book or including a YA book in this kind of, I don't know, in fact I would call it a holy trinity because that's how we find these books so engaging. There's always a wrong, which could be anything from an amusing mix-up to say a life-changing event, and this crime results in some kind of something going wrong, and from a minor nuisance to something with life and death stakes, and at the end there is a resolution, which you could, you could see as justice being done. And in case of children's literature, it's likely to be a positive one. And so I started thinking about how does it apply to my work, because I, think so much about identity and how I represent these identities in whatever I write. And I think that the criminality aspect of it comes from the way that we weaponize normality. That the way in which certain identities and certain expressions that larger society, that adults, in case of if you're looking at it from the point of view of children, they are criminalized, they are punished. And the punishment itself comes in the form of, it could be bullying, it could be exclusion, it could be some kind of there's this word that's just on the tip of my tongue and I can't find it, but there is always a sort of a punishment which becomes central to a conflict. And justice, which is a reconciliation in which both the crime and the punishment are addressed. And if you look at it, you would wonder that why is this a problem? Why, because justice is served, so why should this be a problem? And I know why this is a problem, because I have first-hand experience in this, and it's a problem because it causes harm. And the reason it causes harm is because this justice that is done is still framed in this larger idea of what we see as normality, of this heteropatriarchal, classist, casteist, ableist kind of framework. And despite the fact that we have so many new words, so many new identities, so much more understanding, we are still quite uncomfortable about emerging beyond this bubble of normality. And it causes harm on the ground at the individual level, because it always prioritizes the sensibilities or the comfort of larger society, of other people, rather than the needs of an individual. And in my books, when I talk about identity, I mostly look at queer, disabled sort of identities. And I wanted to illustrate exactly how this harm is caused, because sometimes we don't see it. And I myself, I am still guilty of perpetuating these harms, because this whole framework's idea of normality is so internalized within us. So I did a little experiment with. So fairly late in life, I found out that I was autistic. And it was a huge, it was a life-changing event, obviously, but it was a really good one, because it just made sense of so many things that I couldn't earlier make sense of. So what I did was I went to one of my autistic support groups, and I asked them that, can you remember some of the things that you were told as a child and that you interpreted and internalized in a certain way, and what it resulted in. Now, this was a pretty traumatic experience. The people in the support group have mostly come to terms with it. They are in various stages of understanding the harms that were caused to them. So we kind of crowdsourced this list. Why can't you be like the others? I am ashamed of you. Look at me in the eye when I speak. Look me in the eye when I speak to you. Why can't you be like others? I asked you a question. What's wrong with you? Don't do that. Why do you look like a boy? Why are you so quiet? Why aren't you playing with the other children? Stop looking so serious. You're not even trying. And some of these are pretty innocuous questions. I mean, to ask a child why you're so quiet, or to stop a child from doing something that you think may be harmful to them, or asking them if they'd like to join other children playing. They seem pretty innocuous, but since we were neurodiverse, and the way that we interpreted social social signals and the way that our brains work, what we heard was something very different. What we heard was that my feelings are wrong. I'm too sensitive. Nobody likes me. There's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. It's always my fault. There's something wrong with me. And there's a reason this is repeated, because this is a chant that goes on, that it still goes on in my head. I can't do this. My interests are useless. I am stupid. I look strange and ugly. I can't do anything. So these are the harms that something like that this framework of normality does. So then, am I saying that this whole crime, punishment, justice cycle is that it's a trap? That sure, every book has it, but if you do it, you fall into a trap. It can be, and I think that Slightly Burnt falls into that trap. And I hope you have a recording of the session yesterday, because I want to know what you said about it, because I am because this is a book I would. Fortunately, it's been almost a decade, and I've learned a lot since then. It's not a book that I would ever write again, because this is a very good example of how it does harm, because it takes a queer person's trauma and it frames it in the crime, punishment, justice framework of his straight friend. So the crime that happens, it happens to the straight friend who's like, oh my God, my friend, how can he tell me something like this? She is the one who thinks she's been punished, and she is the one who undergoes this, all this churning within her too. And she's the one who decides, all right, fine, it's okay. So it's a classic case of visibility, but not really representation, because we are talking about someone who, we are talking about a book that talks about a queer person, but it's not exactly telling their story. So, I mean, even though Slightly Burnt, I mean, I feel like it's a problematic book, but it was still, despite that, it was too overtly queer for mainstream children's and young adult literature. It still made people really uncomfortable. Altogether, it is out of print now. Less than 500 copies were sold. I face homophobia from the publisher's employees, and the book was quietly pulped, which was perhaps a good thing, because that meant the rights reverted to me, and so it's now history. So when I wrote It Has No Name, I was, even though I hadn't thought of it in this crime, punishment, justice framework, I wanted to, I had sort of lost my fear of what people are going to think. And I decided to make this book as queer as I possibly dared. And it's about a 16-year-old girl. She's a lesbian. She knows that. She's butch presenting, and she moves to a new town, and it's about how she settles in there. And in this story, I didn't want justice to be defined by patriarchal, heteropatriarchal and ableist society. And even though I didn't quite put it like that in my head at that point, I just knew that this had to be the story where you are actually in the shoes of the queer protagonist as you are experiencing this. And the discomfort that this book is palpable. I mean, I'm sure anybody who has ever published a book knows that the first person to call you up is your mother, saying that how wonderful this is and how this is the book to end all books, and how every single prize is going to land on your laps. But there has been deathly silence from my immediate family, and I take this discomfort as a badge of honor. But on the other hand, the book is sold pretty well, over 1,200 copies in the first year, which is a personal best for me. But I will eat my hat, and of course I'll have to buy a hat first, if it ever makes it to any school event or a children's literary event aimed at children, because I love to see that happen. I don't think that we are quite ready for that yet. So going back to where how Slightly Burnt came about and what I learned from it, it's that what I see as my social justice obligation is that I think that I need to work more on losing the lens of normality in my work. And I think that I need to more critically examine how and what and why I am writing it. And the reason I say that there is a lot of work to be done, and not just by me, but the industry as a whole, is that when it comes to queer representation in books, we have found over the past couple of years that books where these kind of identities are more nuanced or more subtle, they find much greater acceptance. An author that comes to mind is Charles Mahajan, who's Timmy in Tangles, and Riva and Prisha and Riva, one of the two. These books are delightfully subversive. They seem so innocuous, they seem so gentle, and etc. But when you kind of look deep in it, you realize actually how subversive they are, and that's delightful, because you know that, okay, we are infiltrating you, and we'll be there, we'll take over before you figure it out. But on the other hand, what happens is that it still panders to the discomfort. It still colludes in the criminalization of these identities. It still colludes in this weaponization of normal. So again, I'm kind of back to where I started, and the question is that what can I do to lose my lens of normality? So that's all I have to say. Thank you. And I will try to stop.
Ritwika, you're muted.
You're muted.
Remember that I'm muted. Oh God. When I was reading the reviews of It Has No Name, I noticed that there was a discomfort even among the reviewers, and that they were far more willing to impose drawbacks on you rather than accept the text as you have written it, rather than accept you as you have presented yourself. But I would still say that Slightly Burnt is one of those very genre-defining texts, particularly in the history of contemporary Indian children's literature. And yesterday it was spoken about in terms of, it was spoken about by the keynote author, by the keynote addressee, Poshali Bhadari. She was supposed to be here today, she's not. By Poshali Bhadari, in terms of the sort of punishing of queer identities and queer bodies that happens in Indian and in Desi YA. She spoke more about Himanjali Shankar's Talking of Muskan, but Slightly Burnt also came up a lot. And I think Shruti Smita Banerjee is here. I'm sure you know Shruti Smita Banerjee because she had interviewed before for a paper. And I'm pretty sure that she will have a question at some point. I hope she does. So I will move on from that to Tanushree ma'am, because Payal, you were talking about the trauma that the punishing of your neurodivergent identity had on you. A lot of that takes forms of disciplining within the family, within social systems. Tanushree ma'am, in your work with children and with parents, because you work on positive psychology, which is so new, so if you could tell us a bit more about that. What sort of impact, and how do you really seek to unravel that sort of trauma with the children you work with? How do you get the parents out of those typical traditional sort of ingrained mindsets?
I wish there was a switch. I so wish for a switch that we could just click on, because I'll first clarify a little bit about what I do a lot with my time. I barely write, much to my editor's disappointment, but I do work in the area of accessibility of books a lot. So the whole, it could be through the online groups that I run, it could be through the libraries that I support. And now, since these libraries are in different areas in terms of rural, urban, regional presence, that gives an opportunity to gain an insight into the dynamics of that area, when you talk about things like social injustice, what are the common themes throughout, and how are they different from one region to another? So if I were to, talk about, taking on from the whole idea of trauma and what it does to you as a child and as you grow, I would, take you to where I am right now. I am in Himachal, and here I do work with schools. I try and introduce new books here and try to get the children to read a little more diverse literature. And so in my experience, what I consistently saw across the 13 schools that I visit regularly is a very clear discrimination based on caste. So here it's your sexuality is not even a thing here. I mean, of course, it is a thing, it exists, but it is not at the forefront of a visible forefront in terms of visibility. So you can see the discrimination in terms of where they are sitting. It's almost like you're reading Ambedkar right there every day. You're seeing that happen even today. Now, the impact that I see is that, so we have people working here who are from different castes, and I have had long conversations with them that has this particular aspect changed? Has it changed? And how has it impacted them? It hasn't. For the last decades, generations, it has stayed the same. So even today, you have schools where children from so-called lower castes are sitting separately and eating their meals, are sitting on the floor at the back of the classroom, are actively discriminated against. And yes, that trauma, that inherent, that anger would become, it does become a part of them. So there, yes, books would help a little bit. I mean, it's we'll be fooling ourselves if we say that, let's introduce them to these 4 or 5 books and it'll have a bigger impact. You need a bigger involvement of the parents, of the teachers. You have teachers who are actively enabling this discrimination here. It's as simple as that. Now, if you move to urban areas, there, if you were to think that, let's say you go to a very typical public school, which is where you have children from all economic sections visiting. Some of them could be because of the schemes they run. And, so you'll have in a classroom, you'll have children from the upper stratas, from the typical middle class, and some lower income groups. There, again, the discrimination would very much be there on the basis of your economic standing. Now, religion. So discrimination based on religion, which was not extremely visible earlier, is very much visible right there, even in my own classrooms. Here, again, all your gender. So when you were talking of Muskana, it brought back the incident that my son had related to me when he had read it, and how the students who were even a little bit different, so-called, from the norm, a boy carrying a pink notebook or a pencil box, and how he was taunted. And I remember going to the school, volunteering, that, maybe we can have this conversation. I volunteer. I would come and talk to the children. Would you be interested? It's never done, because those issues do not exist to the schools. So here, they do not, any kind of discrimination, any kind of issues which so-called takes away the innocence or traumatizes the kids is swiftly removed from the schools. It could be books. So we have Darkless, which has been banned from a few schools because it talks about dark stuff. And of course, you'll not find Slightly Burned and Talking of Muskan in libraries and schools. Of course not, because that would be exposing the children to too much. So you have, and then, so nobody is really, you can't say that, this particular region is insulated against, or any kind of discrimination. I went to Kaza. There's a friend who runs a library there, and she was relating her experience of working with the little young monks who she had trouble first getting permission to get them to come to the library. Then when they came to the library, the horrors of, how the little children are actually living a very different life from what it is portrayed. So you have that in every strata, every region, the highlight might be different. What you're talking about there might be different. But another common thing there is that adults are happily oblivious. They're not oblivious, of course. They choose to be oblivious. And the system is working fine. So if there is a discrimination based on caste, it is the way the society is. It is how it functions. It's perfectly fine. We don't want to change it. So unless that change, that need to change is seen by every, or at least some parents sitting somewhere remote where there is no network, whatever, and yet they feel that, there is something wrong with the system. I need to work, at least do my bit. There would be really little that we'll be able to do. So you have themes of discrimination, social injustice running through the fiber of society, irrespective of whether the parents acknowledge it or not. Coming to the online groups, quite a few of my friends here are on it, and they have been equally horrified by the questions and the comments that a lot of parents make there. Because there you see a desperate bid to protect the children. And the definition of protection is that the world is a nice, rosy place. There is nothing wrong with it. And if I expose my child to whatever is going wrong, I'd be causing trauma. And and when you talk about sexuality, that's a direct attack on innocence. You can't talk about gender and gender identity and sexuality to little children and ruin their innocence forever. So they're looking for nice, clean books which talk about happy things, cloud, fluff, and rainbows all the time. So I don't know. I mean, I do try to do about the change that you were talking about. I think all of us work like termites, trying to sort of chew everything from the inside. But I don't know how long that'll take, but that's how it is. Over to you. Again, muted. Yes.
I'm going to need a minute to register that dark list, which is like the most innocuous of books that you can think of, has been banned. It has. And now I am confused if I should move on to Samina or to Leah, because I mean, there is the whole issue of Florida's Don't Say Gay ban. And then there is also the issue of regional religious discrimination or class discrimination that, Samina, you work with. I mean, the urge to protect the innocence of children, I think it's not so devious, or it's not so dangerous in Abba's case in Nida, but it's definitely, there is that tremendously overprotectiveness that drives Abba. So maybe, okay, fine, Samina, I'll start with you and then
okay. All right, thank you. Thank you so much. It is actually really lovely to be here and to listen to all this. And, Payal, you've left me with so many questions because I have loved Slightly Burnt, as you know, I think. And so now I think I have to kind of like maybe read it and, look at it with fresh eyes. And you've left me with, lots to think about. And Tanu's work, of course, we are all like big champions of what she does. So thank you. Should I share screen? I can share, yeah. And then I'll just begin. Okay. So yeah, thank you first of all. And I mean, this is something, I'm sure it's been said, and we all are in agreement about that, children's literature really needs to be about children's worlds, about everything that is in children's worlds. And, there's been a lot of work on kind of taking apart the normative ideas of childhood. So we know that, these ideas that this conference is trying to explore, we know that different groups of children experience them in different ways, some more gentler than others. But I think that they do allows us, it's like a little window to begin a conversation with both children and with adults about how human society is constructed, how it is construed, and perhaps then how we can change it. So I'm going to begin by sharing two poems. I'll just read one because of time constraints, but I've put them both on the next slide and maybe you guys can read it. This is my ongoing project on children and citizenship. And the poems demonstrate how injustice is a part of children's everyday life. They've been written by two teenage girls in Govandi in Bombay, who live in the Govandi area is a kind of multi-story resettlement complex, and it's got huge infrastructural challenges. The girls are both from Dalit families, and they go to the local government school. So I'll just read one of the poems, and of course they wrote in Hindi, but I'm going to read the English because I thought maybe not everyone will understand the Hindi. Equality is when mummy gives my sister and I the same amount of money. Inequality is when mummy takes my brother out visiting, but not me. Equality is when my friend and I get the same marks. Inequality is when sir does not give girls a chance to go on stage on August 15th. Equality is when there's a fight in the building and the people on our floor support us. Inequality is when our neighbors don't celebrate our festivals with us. Equality is when everyone goes to vote. Inequality is when someone says, don't talk to her, she's from a lower caste. I wish for a world that was equal, in which no one was shamed. So if children are experiencing injustice in these, multiple layered ways, then how can children's literature not engage with that, right? Because children's literature has to be about their world. The question for me, which is like the challenge and which kind of interests me, is how do we do that? How do we write about, these ideas and experiences, particularly when we come from a location that is so very different? So what I thought I'd do is that I would share some examples from my work to share with you what guides my practice. There are, of course, many things, and I hope most of those emerge as I talk, but the things that I've been really thinking about recently that I would like to focus on are positionality and intersectionality, and of course, the process and the place of interrogation in that process, all of which I think are really critical when we are trying to write narratives around ideas of social justice. So I want to begin by talking a bit about Jamlo walks. So I wrote the story, during the first lockdown, when we were all witnessing the sort of brutality of the state and also of certain groups, middle class families were kind of doing on, the domestic help and things like that. And we saw that, the difficulties, the extreme difficulties of those who live without privilege. So I read Jamlo's story, the report on Jamlo Maktam's story at that time. And I just felt that it was extremely important to talk to children about what was happening, because they were not, as has been already discussed, they are not divorced from it, from what is going on in the world. And I wondered, how would they remember this time when it was past? And would there be a kind of normalizing of what was happening? So I thought it was important to recognize and to put down in some form that, there were people who were facing the impact of what was going on in far worse ways because of the material differences. And I also thought it was important to kind of draw attention to this idea of the shifting lines of, legality and criminality, because with the lockdown, suddenly it became illegal to be outside, to try to earn a living when there were no reserves to fall back on. And so in effect, the state was criminalizing people who did not have means to sustain themselves. And that's, that is perpetuating social injustice. So the story that, Jamlo Walks tries to present is not just that of Jamlo, but also of other children, more middle class experiences, so that so that the story kind of opens out the fact that there are many different experiences of what was going on. This, I think, was for me, it's not just a way of talking about kind of multiple childhoods, because, that we sort of now know. And although, as Tanu had said, that, there is a desire to just talk about childhood in terms of butterflies and clouds, and that continues, but still, I think there is a growing acceptance of the fact that there are multiple childhoods. But I think the thing that we sometimes forget is that, despite those differences, there are also many overlapping universalities. So, the fact that, for example, Jamlo is an example of how child labor manifests itself in our world. But there are also middle-class children actually who are engaged in labor, but this doesn't get kind of recognized. So, for example, children who work in the entertainment industry, or, even this focus on sort of internships and startups and the celebration of that is coming with neoliberal education. So I feel that, we forget that while there are many different kinds of childhoods, there are also certain things that actually bind us together, bind all children together. To be able to write about that, I think it throws up the question of positionality. And it's something that I have in my work, of course, had to kind of think about many, because I'm also a documentary filmmaker, and much of my work has been in spaces which are so very different from my life and where I come from. And I think I've kind of sort of muddled through it most of the time, because and as children's writers, we are so different from the people that we write about, because just by virtue of age, we are so different from them. It is only very recently that, so I think I've been kind of muddling through it in an instinctive way, looking for those, the idea of the connection. And it is only very recently that I was introduced to the work of Lata Mani, who's a feminist historian and a cultural critic and also a filmmaker. And it's really helped me to refine my understanding of positionality. And I want to, first of all, thank Nivedita Subramaniam, she's an author, illustrator, researcher, who actually is responsible for introducing me to Lata Mani's work. So Lata Mani talks about this idea of positionality as delicate locatedness. And, it really speaks to me because it allows for positionality to not be fixed, but to be fluid and dynamic and more sort of exploratory, She uses a phrase that the stories we tell locate us. And I think that points to the kind of interplay between the storyteller and the world, and the shifting circumstance, and how that relationship can also be a shifting relationship. Nivedita herself has actually talked about positionality as a searching compass. And, this approach sort of feels true to me, because otherwise, we, as people who come from privilege, then there's a whole a part of the world that then becomes that we cannot then engage with, and we cannot then enter. So, I'm not comfortable with that. I would like to be able to write about whatever I want to write about, and I would like other people to write about my kind of world and to critique my kind of world as well. So that's why I feel that this kind of, exploratory idea of positionality, it kind of appeals to me, it feels true to me, because I think it is allowing us to look for that layer, of connectedness. And Lata Mani's phrase, a republic of difference, indifferent to our commonalities, it really speaks to me that how do we, then we are not ending up with this sort of like checkbox of diversity, but we are really looking for the layered story, and we're looking for the way in which to tell that layered story, which is really my challenge as a practitioner, and I'm not always successful, but that's the challenge. Now then, how do I address that challenge? And there we come to this idea of process and interrogation. So I thought I'll just quickly talk about My Sweet Home, which is also it's been some years since this book came out. It really came out of a kind of workshop that I did with children after the Butler House encounter in Okhla. So I've done a lot of work in Okhla because I have connection with this space and I live here now, and I've lived here for a while. So when the Butler House encounter happened, again, I thought, this transformation of this space, because the space was in effect criminalized, because it was being reproduced in the media in ways that talked about it as a space that was harboring terrorists. So the question for me was that what's happening with the children who live there, what's happening when they go to school and they see the area surrounded by OB vans. And so the workshop kind of emerged from that. And I had to think about, what is it that I want to do with them? The children were from the two Jamia schools. So they were a little bit mixed because the two schools, the first is a kind of the original Urdu medium school, and the second is a English medium school with a slightly higher fee. So there was a kind of diverse group of kids that I was working with. And I had to think a little bit about how do I want to conduct that writing and art workshop? So because I'm a documentary filmmaker, the everyday interests me. Of course, I wanted to work with the everyday, but there were questions of, would I bring up the encounter or would we wait for the children to bring it up? What were the kinds of things that we would focus on to be able to show similarity, to be able to celebrate difference, And you can see that the encounter comes up on its own. We did an exercise which was about what my neighborhood is famous for. And, some children wrote about markets and some children wrote about food and some children wrote about the encounter because that is what the neighborhood was suddenly being famous for. Breaking stereotypes, it was a way also of waiting to see how just allowing children to write about the everyday, which allowed us to be able to actually break stereotypes. So this boy who wrote about playing cricket and drew about playing cricket and wrote about how he hopes to grow up and play for his country. And for me, it was that this is a cricket match is often the space in which Muslims are othered because they are seen to be supporting the other team, often in India-Pakistan matches. So again, it was a way that everyday life and children's expressions of their everyday life allowed us actually to have a conversation about these things. When I started to think of how to turn the material into a book, actually, that again threw up more questions for me, because then it became about how do I structure this? How do I take what the children have produced in the workshop and turn it into something that could be shared with others? And I think the question also became about could we treat the children's voices as a kind of definitive means of representing this space? And if not, then how do we kind of open it up to what I had not read Spiro at that time, but I think this is what I was working towards, that I was trying to get to, which is the messiness, ambiguity, polyvocality, non-factuality, and multi-layered nature of meaning in stories that research produces. And I think this need to create a space for polyvocality, I tried to kind of come to that by writing some stories which sort of intersect the work in the book and the way the book is structured. And the stories that I wrote draw a little bit from the work that the children have produced. So in that sense, there's a kind of, what I bring into the workshop influences the work that the children produce. And then the work that the children produce influence the stories that I wrote. So there's a kind of leaking into each other's worlds, And I think that sort of allows us also to kind of think about and open up an imagination of how we imagine what can be. Yeah. So it's again this kind of process of questioning, I think, which shapes narratives. And this is what happened with Nida. Nida Finds a Way. So I started writing Nida much before the anti-CAA protest started. And the whole idea was to be able to write a story in which there is a Muslim character, but that Muslimness is not of consequence. Yeah, because there's just not enough representation, and when it is about, what it means to be Muslim. So it came from that place, and I just wanted it to be the story of, a parent and a child, and things that a child is curious about. But then, of course, the protests came in, and because I had located Nida in this space, because I'm familiar with the space, but suddenly the space became familiar to the world. And then I thought that if Nida is an amalgamation of all the sort of children that I have encountered, and then the space that those children inhabit becomes kind of precarious and liminal in terms of legality, then how can I not write that into the story? And that's what happened. So the second half of the book then becomes about Nida's experience with what's going on in her neighborhood, which is the Shine Bagh protest. So I'm just going to read a very small excerpt from Nida, and this is, from a chapter which is called New Words. Over the next few days, this became a regular thing in Nida's world. Hushed conversations inside the house and loud sloganeering on the streets. Sini Baji was busy making posters and was hardly at home. But Fahim Khalu and Sitwat Khala did not stop her, unlike Abba the warrior, who was now permanently in place. Abba's arms flapped when Dadi made the sound and said things like, India is our home, not just this house. Or, hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge. Nida, be careful what you say, Abba said. Words can be troubled. Nida was puzzled. How could words be troubled? But of course, we know now that words can be troubled. We know that today, words that cause hurt sentiments, words that have been used many years ago, and they are shared from many years ago, from someone else's work, that can cause, that can also be seen as a criminal act. And even as, people continue to be incarcerated and, cases are continuing, this line between criminality and legality, it's kind of blurred. Words have always had, words have, that we should not use words lightly, I think is something we all know. Words are not to be used lightly. But I think today there's sort of undeniably a sense of fear in our relationship with words. And I think our world has become a world of flattened meanings. It's a world that is seeking flattened meanings rather than allowing the words to remain a kind of play between the individual writer and the individual reader. So for me, the question is really that, as writers of children's literature, how do we make sense of all of this? Yeah. So I'm going to leave you with this image. This is from my project Hum Hindustani on children and citizenship. If you look closely, you'll see that this is a school, and these are people holding up some sort of placards which say "Nakab wale mana hai." People wearing scarves, veils are not allowed, and these are two girls wearing the veil. This image was made by a Dalit girl in Govandi. And when I probed, I was really curious about why that experience spoke to her. She said to me that it's because she has grown up with Muslims very closely. And so she understands what is it that they feel when something like this happens. So for me, it is this everyday, the everyday that she has experienced and she is able to put into this little drawing. And in what she shared with me, it is this everyday that I think holds the promise, because the everyday is also allowing us to see the kind of fractures in the normative understandings, that, for example, in this case, all Indians are equal. It breaks that, the everyday breaks that, but also the everyday allows us the possibility of transcending those divisions, as I see in this drawing and this expression. So my approach is then to kind of focus on the everyday and perhaps look at the stories that are embedded there and maybe find a different kind of light that shines on those stories so that we can form new ways of sort of being and belonging and talking to each other. So thank you. I'm sure I've overrun the time. I'm really sorry.
I didn't even notice the time. I was just caught up and I was reading while you were reading. And I will just add to your last image with this extremely, extremely powerful image by Priya Korean, who is an illustrated book, which I think really encapsulates the sort of sentiment of Indian identity that we should all be holding. I had questions for Leah about her work with we talked about talking about Tomorrow Appears. But Samina, you brought up the way words are being flattened and the way words are being criminalized. And the last image that you shared, it's just brought too much into mind of the sort of news that is filtering this way from the US. And before we get on to the fantasy part of it, Leah, I mean, yesterday Jamie Fine was talking about the gun violence and the adolescent legal culture in the US, and we spoke about Ulvade did not come up, but we spoke about other issues, and we spoke about Roe versus Wade. Your thoughts?
How long do we have? First, thank you so much.
We have time, it's fine.
Yeah, it's... I mean, first, Jamie Fine is an absolute rock star, and I'm in awe every time I hear her speak. She's absolutely amazing. You're right, the narratives, the language, the discourse that's happening in the States at the moment is really responsible for perpetuating this kind of system of violence that I think is underpinning a lot of what we're talking about here today, and kind of how we're negotiating those systems of violence. And Texas really is at the forefront of so much of this in so many really, really terrible ways.
And don't say gay bill in Florida. I think Florida is equally culpable here.
And I'm 16 years in England, but I grew up in Tennessee, which it is pretty bad. And all my family are still there, and it's a language problem. It's a language problem, I think, in so many ways, and it's the way we're clamping down on. I'm thinking about book bannings, and my head's going to a number of different things, and about how schools in Texas and Tennessee and Florida and in many of these kind of red conservative states are not allowing critical race theory to be taught, are not allowing. Oh, there's a school system in Texas that is banning children or anyone from bringing pride flags into campuses. And they've also told staff member within the schools that they're not allowed to put their pronouns in their email signature, because identifying myself as she, her, or as she, they, or they, them might make someone uncomfortable. So we're not there. The teachers in the school system are not allowed to put their pronouns in their signatures. And it's just this attack on personal choice and personal freedom. And it's this, and this is what I'm going to kind of think about when I start thinking about the fantasy, actually, which is kind of an interesting way of going about it. But it's this scared of choice almost that's becoming this reaction that's very violent, and it's clamping down on personal choice and personal freedom, and making this kind of normal and normative ever narrower. And it's for me, it's why children's and young adult literature and conferences like this one are so very, very important, because we're making noise about those books that are recognizing the commonalities in our differences, right? That are recognizing how we're related to one another as human beings who walk on this earth. And we all face different challenges in different ways. Positionality that Samina was talking about so beautifully in just a minute ago. Thinking about, instead of thinking about ourselves in opposition to one another, how do we relate to one another? And that's, really the heart of what I'm going to talk about in terms of fantasy in just a minute. Do you want me to crack on talking about fantasy now? I've got slides. Let me get that set back up for 2 seconds.
You should have share access.
Yeah, thanks. I was flicking through them, kind of trying to decide if I wanted to change things last minute. No, I'm not going to. I'm going to leave them alone. So if we share. Fantastic. So I'm thinking today about what I'm calling modeling relational activism. There's a half a dozen other things I could have talked about, but for one thing, I'm in love with Dane and Tamora Pierce's Immortals Quartet. And I just think we don't make enough noise about her. We don't make enough noise about Tamora Pierce, who's an American YA scholar who's been writing YA fantasy since the 1980s, kind of in general, But even those of us who are talking about Pierce spend a lot of time talking about her first set of books about Alana, who cross-dresses to become a knight of the realm of Tortal. But we don't talk about this beautiful, beautiful series that's doing a lot of work around eco-justice and this relational model of activism that I'm going to talk about. So in my research more widely, I'm particularly interested in representations of adolescent girlhood, and especially about how female heroes, which is the book project that I've been finishing up, are intervening in what I call the violent hierarchy, radical alterity, isolating individuality, and erasure, particularly of bodily difference, or gender and sexuality differences, those things that are kind of really tied to the body. We don't want bodies to be different, we want them all to be the same. Marking what it means to be a self, that kind of normal person we've been talking and hearing so much about. I call him the archetypal hero in my book, so like Beowulf and Odysseus and Aragorn and those kinds of Luke Skywalker, those kind of white cis het men that dominate pages and screens. And I argue that female heroes offer a model of selfhood that recognizes plurality and change. It forms through connection. It makes space for kinship that's informed by an ethos of ethical responsibility. But it's not opposed to violence, and sometimes it does use violence to enact social justice. And I want to take a closer look at that system for just a second, if I can find my window. This system kind of underpinning Western thought, really, Western rationality, is one steeped in opposition. This idea of A is A because it's not A. So an archetypal hero is a hero because he's not the monster. A man is a man because he's not a woman. Rational is rational because it's not irrational. Humans are human because we're not animals. This kind of oppositional way of defining ourselves. And for me, and in the work I do, that oppositionality is part and parcel, is fundamental, is core to kind of all of these alterities that we're experiencing in the real world, right? And so I'm interested in fantasy and how fantasy is negotiating that system and disrupting it. And the thing that I actually wrote up, I said for this oppositional logic to function, so for A to remain superior to not A, for A to be in a position of power, to maintain that kind of illusion of it being the good, the best, the thing we all kind of want to be, and I'm using massive air quotes there. For this oppositional logic to function, there has to be a clearly defined void, a schism between those opposing sides, right? They can't touch one another, because if they do, they might risk bleeding into one another. If there's no indisputably blank space between the hero and the monster, if they're not radically opposed to one another, they might not be so different. They might be the same. And this system impacts anyone, and especially who exists in those positions of inferiority. So women, people of color, disabled people, neurodiverse people, anyone who aren't that kind of normal person that we kind of put in that position of power, right? But one thing I really also want to think about is how when any of those markers of alterity overlap, the othering gets worse. So it's one thing just to be a woman, but to be a brown woman or a black woman or a brown woman who is also queer or a black woman who is also disabled makes it inherently worse. There's no one size fits all to the way the system works. It proliferates and impacts our lives in so many different ways. Female heroes occupy the spaces between oppositions radically and dynamically to embrace a sort of disruptive potential. They're adolescent girl heroes for the main part, but as I'll kind of get into a little bit, they're not every single girl hero. So Katniss Everdeen, Bella Swan, Clary Frey aren't doing the work that female heroes are doing. In fact, they're perpetuating heroic norms and standards. They're perpetuating the sort of normal idea of what it means to be a person by kind of reinforcing that system of kind of violent opposition, reinforcing, they're all white, thin, fit, kind of exceptionally pretty girls, right? I use the hyphenated figure, that kind of figuration that you see on your screen throughout my work, to kind of signify the way the female heroes I'm interested in, so not Katniss and Bella, but Dane, the female hero I'm going to talk about in a minute, who is able to shapeshift, or Alana, who cross-dresses, or Cinder in Marissa Mayer's Lunar Chronicles, who is a cyborg. She's part human, part machine. She's also supposed to be Cinderella, but kind of isn't because of all the ways her body is doing different things, right? These female heroes are liminal, and they're occupying liminal spaces. So I could talk about any one of those, but I really do want to focus on Dane. And sadly, not the rampaging dinosaurs that a couple of people have told me they wish I was talking about. Instead, I want to think about how she can shapeshift. Dane, first of all, is the daughter of a mortal woman and a sort of lesser god within this polytheistic religious system that exists in the imaginary world she lives in, called Tortall. She's also from the north of Tortall, which in this world is the sort of it's not the capital city. It's the kind of hinterland. It's where it's that when we perceive the sort of city country divide, it's where we're kind of operating on those sorts of things. So she's from the north, which is economically disenfranchised. It's geographically isolated. She believes herself to be a bastard. She doesn't know who her father is, and so she's taken on kind of all of these alterities. She also doesn't look like the people from her village, and that's a lovely fan depiction of Dane with her gorgeous dark brown curls and sort of darker skin tone. And she lives in a place where everyone's kind of white and blonde haired and blue eyed, and so she just really doesn't fit within her world. But it's because her father is a god, and he's the god of the hunt. And in so being, Dane, his daughter, and the daughter of her mortal mother, is of the people, the folk of claw and fur, wing and scale. And the people are animals within this world. And Dane is one of them just as much as she is human. That is, while she may look like a human, she isn't just or only human. She's both animal and human. And this being is fundamental to who she is and to the disruptive and relational power that she wields. Owing to this being, Dane has a knack with animals. She's able to speak with them, a sort of mind-to-mind communication. She can heal them, and she ultimately learns to become them, or to shapeshift into an animal form that is just as much a part of her as is her human form. In Wolf Speaker, the book I had on the title screen, Dane's just beginning to learn the extent of her powers. And that story begins with her being summoned to the Long Lake region of this world, and to Fife Dunlap in particular. And it's no ordinary summons. It comes from the Long Lake Pack, a group of wolves that Dane first encountered in a preceding book. These wolves, led by Brokefang and his mate Frostfur, are concerned with the human activity that's destroying the lake and the surrounding valley. Dane, along with her mentor Numair, the dragon Sky Song, and horses Cloud, Mangle, and Spots, answer the wolves' call, only to discover that things are much worse than they imagined. A group of nobles and mages, led by the Lord and Lady of the Fife, are mining for opals, this sort of rare, extremely valuable natural commodity. And in so doing, they're committing deforestation, they're polluting the lake that is at the center of this valley. They're also plotting rebellion, and if that succeeds, they have this magical spell that's going to utterly destroy the land. And as Dane kind of comments, as they kind of get to the valley and see what's actually happening on the ground, few trees stood in the upper 10 miles of the lake's western edge. Most lay in a wood between a fort structure and the river that flowed into the northeast end of the lake. Much of the ground between that fort and their vantage point was heaped into mounds of dirt and rock. The only greenery to speak of was patches of scraggly weed. The way in which this passage echoes descriptions of real-world land after deforestation, intensive mining and farming practices, or housing projects in this country or railways, should not go unnoted. And it's also important to point out that this work is being undertaken through slave labor, effectively. Ogres that have been captured have been put, are being forced to do all of this work for the Lord and Lady and these mages who are wanting to overthrow Tortall effectively, while getting really rich doing it by finding these opals. So Dane has been brought to the valley, and here's a quick passage about kind of what's actually happening to the animals within the space. But Dane's been brought to the valley to save the inhabitants, right? And she is to shape a bridge between kindreds, to find allies, to disrupt the power imbalance. And she's uniquely qualified to the task, but her uniqueness isn't grounded in opposition. Dane is uniquely suited to the task because she is the only one within this world that speaks to all the inhabitants of it. She can speak to the animals that you kind of can see in that image. She can speak to the immortals, and she can speak to humans. So she's to use that power of language that she possesses to build bridges and to find allies. So central to Dane's ability is her ability to communicate with the various beings, a skill that she develops in this book, and it really lays the foundation for this relational model of activism that I'm quite interested in. And here, the Badger God, who is one of her mentors, tells Dane that if you try, you can learn to enter the mind of a mortal animal. You can use their eyes as you would your own, or their ears, or their noses. Make your mind like that of the animal you wish to join, he told her. Think like that animal does until you become one. You might be quite surprised what happens in the end. Full body shape-shifting is what results in the end. But the first time Dane attempts this sort of semiotic joining, it doesn't work. And this not working is incredibly important. The girl closed her eyes. Breathing slowly, she reached down deep inside to find the pool of copper light that was her wild magic. Calling a thread of fire from that pool, she reached for Cloud, a horse, a friend of hers, thinking to bind their minds together, right? Cloud whinnied, breaking the girl's concentration. That hurt, the mare snapped. The pool of copper fire and in other passage surrounding a core of white fire that is Dane's human self. So even here we see this sort of hybridity of her very being. But in this first instance of trying to become or join with her animal friends, she approaches the task through a position of superiority, right? She wants to stick, glue, bind, join their minds together. And it doesn't work. It hurts Cloud. So after a second, a third, a fourth attempt where she keeps operating from this sort of position of a human sort of in a superior position, trying to invoke this sort of magic on the being, she finally asks. She asks the question, how can I do this? How can I do this without paining you? And in this moment, she opens herself up to, or is represented as doing so, to the presence of the other. She's willing to listen. She's to take into account Cloud's perspective. And in this case, Cloud goes, without the fire, you don't need it to talk or listen to us. Why should you need it now? And that image of fire, and just given, the real world destruction that fire causes and the way fire has been used against people and animals and the land in so many ways, to think that she's going to not use that fire and she's going to just listen becomes really, really important. And that's the solution, really, listening. In these failed attempts with Cloud, Dane hasn't been listening. She's been dominating, seeking to exert her will over Cloud to force their binding. Things change after this conversation. Indeed, Dane's next attempt with Brokefang, the leader of the Long Lake Pack, goes much better. She closed her eyes, took a breath, let it out. Sounds pressed on her. Nymere's snore, short snouts, moan as he dreamed of rabbits, the pups chewing, battle washing a paw. She concentrated on Brokefang until she heard fleas moving in his pelt. He yawned inside her ears. This time Dane listens, and this isn't just a physical hearing through her ears. She closed her eyes, kind of starts to signal. This listening is part of Dane's meditative practice, and it involves opening her consciousness, the core of her very self, up to others. In listening in this way, and in focusing on Brokefang, she moves closer and closer to him until she's able to see things from his point of view. Why it skipped slides there. She listened for his thoughts and found them. The odor of the blood from his kill, the drip of water from the trees overhead, the joy of being one with the pack. Brokefang sighed. Dane was sleepy, her belly overfull and rumbling as it broke down elk meat. The change from Brokefang and Dane, sort of an independence, to deign within Brokefang is subtle, but it occurs after that sigh. From that point, he and Dane are sharing a single consciousness. I mean, in the book project, I go on to talk about how this is negotiated and how her consciousness never works to overwrite his, and his never works to overwrite hers, and that the books are very preoccupied with kind of the impact of this sharing of consciousnesses and kind of what it does to sort of both parties. But here, this merging within selves is what ultimately gives Dane the power to become that part of herself that is hidden when she's in her human form. It's the first step to kind of shape-shifting. And for me, it's a really powerful demonstration of the way female heroes are embodying relation instead of opposition and laying foundations for sort of radical relational forms of activism that can undermine the sort of dominant and dominating normals and hierarchies. Yeah. Thank you. And I put my pretty book cover on the last slide.
I think this is reading the series will be the first thing I do once I submit my thesis. That's a good 2 years away, Leah, so you'll have to wait 2 more years for my thoughts. And you have set us up perfectly, actually, to segue into Savi, who does have this wonderful connection with Shree, just as Dane does with animals. And so, Bijal, how does I have 2 questions basically for you. One is how your environmental activism as a climate warrior, as a certified climate warrior and a warrior, how that affects and influences and really builds your vision in your books. That's one. Okay, I have 2.5 questions. That's one. The second question is, because there are these elements of fantasy which does exist in both. Certainly in Savi more so, but also in Bura, because the cloud is the sort of fantastical. It almost has a personality of its own. You do have these moments in between where the cloud is talking with poems that I'm not going, you can do whatever you want to me. So fantasy does work in a way, even though you're portraying a very realist image, you're portraying a realism, basically. I don't really have another word for that. Savi also, I mean, it brings to mind, I think, the current opposition to the metro shed that is happening in Bombay, because it's supposed to wipe the RA forest clean. My 0.5 question is that at the end of Savi, the very hip and cool people turn into pigeons. Why pigeons? You're muted.
I was saying spoiler. Everyone ignore that.
My ornithophobic brain kind of fixated on that, and it was just...
Sure, that's right. Firstly, so lovely to listen to everyone, and so many points, and I've been taking notes. So, to start with your first question, over my years of working as a journalist and in environment, as a reporter, as an activist, as a school educator, I've had the privilege of meeting children who really care about animals, about wildlife, about climate change. I've met a teenager who raised money to help tigers. He would stand outside Jahangir Art Gallery and sell his art. He would also tell his parents, if you want me to do a chore, you're going to have to pay for it. And he's ended up raising something like 1 lakh rupees for the tiger. I met children who got together to clean the buffer zone of Ranthambore Tiger Reserve, to children who came together in different parts of the country to form this junior tiger task force when India was having its own tiger crisis. And it all came to a point where I just realized that children really care about nature. And which is why I wrote A Cloud Called Bura, which has the premise that when it comes to climate change, it becomes more about the way perceptions frame the phenomena, or rather than science. And second, that children have a very strong sense of justice. So I was studying climate change in Costa Rica, actually, which is when I came across this Asian brown cloud phenomenon. And this was a brown cloud of pollution that scientists were seeing with satellites. But I was just wondering that what if this actual brown cloud was to come and hover on top of my city, which was Mumbai? And how would everyone react? And which is why I wrote Mota Bhai, the politician. I wrote Vatudio Bauche, the journalist. I wrote scientists. Of course, they're twins because hello, Bombay, so Bollywood is important. But yes.
I love the very, very sneaky references to certain very loud people who really
I have no clue what you're talking about. Thank you. And interestingly, children get it all the time. So they've come up to me with great questions around them. But, while I was writing these characters, I kept listening to that gut feeling that it would be the children who would take charge. They would be the one who would ask questions. They'd be the one who'd want answers. And that's what happens in Bura. There's Ammi, there's Tammy, there's Mithil, and Andrew is the other children who's like, I've got homework to do. That's how they came into being. And, it took me 6 years to write this book, and Payal knows how much I've struggled with it because we were at a residency at that point of time when I came up with that ending for Bhura. And it finally came out in 2019 when something wonderful actually happened. Children across the world began to answer Greta Thunberg's call for Fridays for Future. There were protest marches, there were rallies, there were Instagram accounts suddenly popping up everywhere. There were little actions happening across the world. And this really underscored my belief that it's children who form their future, especially when it comes to climate justice. And that said, it's also very disappointing that we've just decided that the future must rest on these young shoulders. And I was interviewing for this book, 10 Indian Champions of Fighting to Save the Planet, which I co-wrote with my friend Radha. We interviewed a climate scientist, and Meenal Pathak said something really interesting. She said that I find it both embarrassing and inspiring that kids are leading the climate movement. They've really achieved remarkable success. Greta Thunberg and her gang are calling out policymakers, something most of us have shied away from here. And at the same time, what we are seeing is that there's a slew of climate books, which in fact is being called the Greta Thunberg effect, that are aimed at empowering young people being published. In fact, according to some figures, the numbers of new children's books looking at the climate crisis, global heating, natural world more than doubled in a year. Yet, you all follow children's literature in India. You know that climate stories here are still languishing. And that concerns me because how else are we going to give children the imagination to understand what's now not their future, but a reality of the present? Because, climate, according to me, and of course I'm not biased, it encompasses everything today. It's about gender justice. It's about the fact that women and children are most vulnerable when it comes to the crisis, that unpredictable weather patterns, disaster impact their education. We're already grappling with learning losses in the wake of the pandemic. The fact that climate change is making us less tolerant. And the worst thing, it's impacting the marginalized. And which is actually how I ended up writing Tammy, because my first draft of Bhura only had Amni, which is this privileged child who cares a lot and wants to change the system. And then I realized that climate is about the fact that it is unequal. It causes more harm to marginalized community. And that's how I wrote Tammy, who is one of my favorite characters, and that's how she just walked into the story. And the other thing that I did while researching Bhura was I ended up talking to a bunch of children. I went to Parikrama School in Bangalore. I spoke to friends who have children. I went to different schools, and I basically asked them what they think about climate change. And there's a full chapter in which the children meet to discuss what they should be doing about this brown cloud. All those children are real, because I wanted to make sure that my story reflects what they think. But as I was researching this, what came to me was that a lot of children today and their parents are facing climate anxiety. They're facing climate grief. And there are many other reasons, but that's how Savi and the Memory Keeper came. into being. It's about a girl who loses her father, and at the same time they move to a new city which has this magical climate. And going to your second question was, it comes from a very simple fact. I think the real magic is nature. That's why I keep adding fantasy. The fact is that if you talk to a tree, there is a conversation to be had. I think there is magic in bioluminescence. I think there is magic in elf caps, which are little fungi that you see and look like little elf cups, which look like little cups. There's magic in the frog, galaxy frog, which looks like it's black and has little silver stars on it. I mean, if that's not magic, what is? And I think that's one of the reasons why I constantly give voice to creatures, to trees, to menacing clouds in my books, because I think that we are always conversing with nature. All of us have forgotten to listen and have that conversation, a phenomenon that's actually called the environmental generational amnesia. And so for me, that becomes very crucial. In fact, I've got a fairy tale coming out next year, which is just basically a mashup of magic and nature. So, and lastly, I wanted to actually touch on something that Tanu brought out. I also think that what we're all doing is crucial, but it becomes much more important to make sure that our readers have access to these stories, because often stories of climate change, of gender justice, of depression, they may not always be accessible to children. And that's why I love the work that Samina and Tanu do. They take stories to children. They, bring back stories for all of us. And accessibility is something that I kind of feel is very crucial when we are talking about narratives around these subjects as well. And lastly, I'm going to end with two things. One is that 2019, I had a session at Buckaroo. And, it was the year when Delhi had its highest smog recording of 912 AQI and things like that. So literally my room was full of children who were just there because they had been impacted by the smog in one way. And one boy told me that I'm here because when the smog situation was really bad, my parents took me away because I had asthma. You tell me, how is that fair? I want answers. For a project that I'm doing right now, we're asking children to give us their thoughts on climate change. One boy in Bombay wrote, "My lungs hurt." Now I want to know, how is that fair? That children feel like this about their climate. So, which is why I kind of feel like the way to deal with this for me is I always misquote one of my favorite people, that's Rachel Carson, who was an environmentalist and an amazing nature writer. And I'm just going to end with misquoting her because I love doing that. And she talked about how children are born with a sense of wonder about nature. So if a child is to keep alive their inborn sense of wonder, they need the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, and a lot of books which a child can read, rediscovering with the adult and the books the joy, excitement, and mystery of the natural world we live in. Thank you.
Does this panel have to end? Because I thinking of that, I had so many questions now, because Amni and Savi, they are both, of course, these are girls who are leading the charge. Savi is reluctant at the beginning for various reasons, which I completely empathized with. And it was a bit of a difficult book for me to read because I'm still working through a lot of grief myself. They are girls who take charge. And you do really, but more than that, they are girls who are very acutely aware of inequality, because Savi herself comes from, she's on a back foot when it comes to her caste position. Amni is, even though she's not particularly experiencing that level of privilege inequality, she has friends who do. The other thing that struck me is the sort of absence that parents have. And Tanushree, you were talking about this earlier, that the urge to protect and maintain the innocence, that plays out a lot in the books, I think, as not giving parents a super active role in many of the books, even in yours, Bijal, to an extent, because the parents in Hura don't get involved in much later. And in Savi's mother is well in her own space till right near the end. So it's not so much a question, but it's more, I'm just thinking of all these connected issues that you all have brought up, and how that highlights and how that represents children who would otherwise be silenced by ultra-conservative right-wing groups or ultra-conservative people who are happily saying that Greta Thunberg is not speaking out against climate change of her own volition, but because her parents are making her say that, as if Greta doesn't have her own agency. Do situations like these, especially when it comes to climate change, since you work in Himachal, Tanushree, does climate change and climate trauma feature in the children you work with?
So we are bringing that about now. I mean, we are at so right now where I am, a simple thing of garbage management and how that affects and how they deal with it. So here the biggest problem is forest fires. They are lit because of some old legends that they stick on with, that it's going to cause rain, and so we are trying to bust that and involve children, in that sort of movement. But it's very difficult to get past the gatekeepers. So the books that you were mentioning, imagine if Harry Potter was living with his parents, none of the books would have happened.
Speaking of Harry Potter, I mean, it is a text, and because of its author, which has been very controversial for the last few years, because J.K. Rowling is, not to mince words, she's a tough. But parents, especially in India, do have this sort of rose-colored filter that they look at the text through, which continues to occupy tremendous spaces. But there is, I would argue, a damage that the text does subconsciously to its child reader. What are your thoughts about Harry Potter? Anyone can take that
first. See, I personally, so there are times when I'm outraged when I read newer comments and all, but then when somebody picks up that book in the library, I've got Hindi translation here, and a child in this valley reading it and coming back with something that stayed with that child, then I don't know how to really react. So I don't enforce what I think on these children. It's only that, okay, I let them read, let them sort of get into it, let them finish the series, and then maybe bring up what's been going on behind the scenes. So I'm looking for answers there. I can't really say that I'm on this side or that. I definitely am disillusioned by the entire thing, by the entire series at this point of time. But I also see the excitement that the children have around it. So I honestly don't know how to deal with it.
Can I chip in?
Absolutely.
So it is interesting, and I don't really have any conclusive answers, but I think it's like Harry Potter is probably a classic case of something that hasn't aged well in terms of, how values evolve. Because I was always, I always, much as I loved the books when I read them, and much as I completely loathe the vile person who wrote them, even when I read them, there were signs of course, I read them as an adult, so that does make a difference. There were signs of how traditional she was, her ideas of how gender is represented, and how, this whole witch and wizard binary, compulsory heterosexuality, and, like making Dumbledore gay after the fact doesn't count. So there were always these red flags in the books that I kind of told myself, all right, don't let your imagination run away with you, and actually, when Rowling came out with her, controversial ideas about what women are and aren't, I honestly wasn't surprised, because the books do come from a very traditionalist, very kind of set in ways sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, kids love them, don't they? I mean, they are available in languages, and they are still being sold in hundreds and hundreds of numbers, and there's big merchandise, and yeah, I mean, I can't get my head around how I'm supposed to think about it.
Why I'm specifically asking about Harry Potter is because, particularly in the way Rowling depicts resistance towards oppressive governments, especially book 5 onwards, you have the figure of Umbridge, who is just vile as vile can be. And then she goes on and just invalidates an entire identity. I mean, it's this idea of social justice that Rowling forwards in the book, which has become so controversial, I think. I mean, does that idea of Rowling's does Rowling's idea of social justice even hold anymore? I mean, does that, in the light of her comments, does that, and her doubling back on it, does that even, I mean, can it even be taken seriously? I'm really enjoying the look on Leah's face right now.
I think what you're asking is that, because of what has happened, does it completely invalidate the place of the books, right? Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think really Tanu and Payal have kind of answered it. I don't think any of us have easy answers to that. But the thing is that we have to remember that this sort of, taking the child's agency away comes not just from so-called regressive on the right forces, but actually comes also from the liberals, no? Liberals are just as complicit in wanting to push a certain kind of agenda, right? And so, and who has voice and who has expression, and what should be cancelled and all of that. There is, I don't think in that sense there is that big a difference. So yeah, I mean, I feel the thing is, yeah, I'm also really mixed about it, because the fact is that, when I also read it as an adult, there was a moment of some, like to be able to see some of, like even say a character like Parvati Patil in that kind of context, it was something, So I would say that all we can do is contextualize, and constantly contextualize and keep kind of like opening that conversation out, But in the end, I think it has to be the relationship between the book and the individual reader. And that is between them. But that conversation, I think, then has to be sort of situated in a context where we can then talk about all the other stuff that follows, so that maybe we will relook at everything. I mean, like Payal spoke about Slightly Burnt, and she, as the writer, is now looking at it in a completely different way. So I think we have to allow that space and remain a little bit generous in the way that we talk.
Bijal, you mentioned Panju in the comments. I don't consider Cursed Child as canon, so.
Fair enough. It just was one of the most unfortunate naming situation. I also think it's time that we all start talking about more inclusive texts, because I think there's fantastic work happening out there. And if we start instead talking about those, championing those, I think that's something that will go a longer way in introducing new titles, helping educators, librarians, readers discover more titles where there are characters who look like you, who sound like you. I mean, and here's the thing, like, for instance, over time, I've come to love Rick Riordan more because of that. We'll not go into some of the problems that we've had with Daughters of the Deep, which there's a whole Instagram conversation between me and Dipanjana on that. But that said, he's created some fiercely extraordinary characters, and most of them ring very true when you read them. And I think that's what I want to celebrate constantly.
Yeah, and I also feel like it's an ongoing journey that is never going to end. It's about experiencing, learning, and unlearning as well, and it's sort of important to remember that things change, your perspectives changed, and even values change. And yeah, I mean, I think listening is also really important now. And yeah, like Bijal said, that celebrating what's coming and what is now out there is what we need to focus on.
Leah?
No, picking up what Payal said, it's that, isn't it? So one of the things that I focus on is the sort of changing nature of young adult fiction over the last sort of 30 years. And the kinds of intervention that were possible within the marketplace, we have to remember it is a marketplace, were narrower than the kinds of intervention that are possible now. And the intervention now is still quite narrow. So we're getting better. And that's not to excuse books that get books, but it's to add another lens, another way of thinking about it, right? That, maybe that generosity for book, not author's comments, perhaps. Thinking about that. But also, seconding that call to talk about the good stuff. We spend so much time, and it's easy to do, to teach, to talk about the books that I walk into a conference of non-specialists and I want to talk about young adult fiction. I'm going to name drop Twilight, The Hunger Games, because it's pretty guaranteed that even the 30-year-old dude in the room is going to have encountered them at some point, right? But it's doing that work, doing that really hard work sometimes, and maybe not using the crutch, not using the easy thing, and going ahead and talking about the really great young adult fiction that's being published all over the world. I'm going to plug a class I'm teaching at the minute, an international youth lit class for San Jose State University over in America. And it's a library and class, Master of Library and Information Sciences. And I'm grading, I've just started, and I get to finish them over the next week. Their second assignment for me, which is to develop a core collection of 25 books from a geographical cultural region not their own. And I really encourage them not to go England, Ireland, Australia, and to kind of really push their boundaries beyond that kind of Western white world. And it's just an absolute joy to get these future librarians finding these books. And that's the kind of work that I think just gently let the other things fall to the side and start talking about the good stuff, the new stuff. Yeah.
Okay, we are actually a bit over time according to the brochure, but I'm going to quickly just read through some of the comments that have come in. So Shruti Banerjee writes, Payal, I was outraged to hear your book has been pulped. So was I. To me, it's a seminal book that turns the gaze on one of the most invisible and repressed sections of our community, the gay child. While I agree that both Slightly Burnt and Talking of Muskan would have benefited from giving the gay character a voice and more central role, I also concur. I do believe that your approach in the book is valid because, after all, the most pressing challenge the gay child faces in recognizing and coming to terms with their sexuality, especially in India, is facing the repercussions from family and society. That is true. And I think in both Muskan and in Slightly Burnt, we don't see the parents or the larger family coming to terms with or even knowing that this is how Muskan or now I'm blanking out on the name. It's Slightly Burnt. Why?
Sahil.
Yes, Sahil. I remembered Komal and I forgot Sahil. Muskan and Sahil.
I think that's the problem.
Yeah, or even Muskan's brother, who is Sahil's partner. The two of them. I mean, the parents don't really at all. You do have homophobic characters, but the parents don't. There is that point where the happiness has to be preserved.